Chapter 6 of Tractate Bava Basra continues going through the various laws of sales. The first Mishnah says, if somebody sells produce to another without specifying if it was to be used for planting or for eating, and the buyer then planted it and it didn't grow, the seller is not held responsible for the loss, even if it's something that is typically used for planting. However, some add if the plant was something that could only be used for planting, like garden seeds, which are inedible, the seller is responsible for the loss. The Gemara quotes a related case. If somebody bought an ox and found it was a dangerous animal that gored people, there's a debate if the seller must refund him, based on whether or not the seller can claim that he sold the animal to be eaten, not for work. This case is clarified to be where the person typically buys oxen for either use, and also where the cost of the ox for meat and an ox for work is the same. So the difference as to who's liable is really as to who's responsible to dispose of the ox between the buyer or the seller. Essentially, the debate as to the status of the animal is as to whether the principle of majority applies. The first opinion said this purchase is undone, as majority of people buy oxen for plowing. The second opinion says the purchase stands as he holds majority is not a followed principle within monetary law. It brings a series of different cases to try and prove like either opinion. Some additional cases are brought. Anyways, the Mishnah stated that if somebody sells a man defective garden seeds, he needs to repay him. Some say this is just the cost for the seeds. Some say he also needs to reimburse him for the expenses. It explains sources for these opinions. New Mishnah. If somebody sells grain to another man, the buyer automatically accepts a quarter kav per sa'ah ratio of impurities within the grain. For figs, the ratio is 10 wormy figs out of every 100, or 1 for every 10. For a seller of wine, he accepts 10 sour barrels per 100, and from kegs from the region of Sharon, he accepts 10 poor quality ones for every 100. The Gemara says, when it says a quarter kav of impurities per sa'ah of grain, this refers to legumes being mixed in, and it's not in reference to soil or dirt. It's debated exactly as to what a permissible ratio of dirt within would be. Additionally, some say that if a buyer is sifting through grain he's purchased, as there's an excess of impurities, he's allowed to sift through everything and return all impurities. Some explain this to be just his legal entitlement to return all of these impurities, more than just the extra if they exceed the permitted ratio. Others say it's actually a penalty, that if the impurities exceed the permitted ratio, he's now allowed to return all of the mixed impurities. It argues proofs and disproofs for this from several different discussions. These are additionally spoken on. There are further of these, but it winds up just being inconclusive. Anyways, it was said that within a sale of a seller of wine, a person accepts every 10 out of 100 to have gone bad. Now, if the seller had said he's selling a seller of wine, he'd be obligated to give only superior quality wine. And if the man said he's selling this seller of wine, he can sell souring wines. And if he said he's selling this seller, he's allowed to even sell vinegar. So it's explained the case must be that he sold a seller of wine, and it's amended that in such a case, there's still a permitted ratio of 10 poor quality barrels out of every 100. This would not apply if the sale was for a single barrel. Others debate this concept and it's particularly qualified. For instance, if somebody said he's selling a cellar of wine for cooking, everything within must be of a superior quality. If he said he's selling this cellar of wine for cooking, all of the wine must be of superior quality, but the buyer also accepts every 10 out of 100 barrels as poor quality. If the seller said he's giving this cellar of wine and doesn't specify the use, he can give souring wine. If the seller said he's selling a cellar of wine without specifying the use, it's a debate as to if the buyer needs to accept the ratio of poor quality wine, which is discussed further. Also somewhat related, it was said in the very first Tractate Barachos, that the blessing on wine is boire piri hagafen. Some say this same blessing is also said on soured wine, others said instead the blessing shahakal should be said. Although it is agreed if it's extremely poor quality wine, like wine pressed from grape kernels, it has the blessing shahakal said on it. This debate is essentially as to whether souring wine is considered to be wine. It argues this from a case on the laws of tithes. It said that if somebody examined a barrel of wine and then finds that it's turned to vinegar, it said that all 3 days the barrel's contents are considered to be certain, and afterwards they're uncertain. There's a debate as to what this means. Some say that during the first 3 days since the first inspection, the barrel is assumed to have been wine, and from then until the next time the barrel was opened, it's considered to be vinegar. Afterwards, it has a doubtful status. This is as he holds that wine sours from the top downwards, and even if it had been about to turn to vinegar right after the first opening, he would have been able to tell from the smell. Others say that actually the last 3 days before it was opened the second time, it's assumed to be vinegar, and beforehand, it's uncertain. This is as this opinion holds that wine sours from the bottom up, which is qualified. A third opinion holds that the first 3 days after the first checking, it's definitely wine, and the last 3 days before the second checking, it's definitely vinegar, and in between, it's uncertain. And this opinion explains it specifically where the vinegar was extremely strong, meaning it agrees with the first opinion, but as the vinegar is very strong, it must have had turned to vinegar for a few days already. Anyways, it's still a debate as to if souring wine has the blessing of shahakal or hagafen stated over it. Related, It said, if somebody sells a barrel of wine to another and it turned to vinegar, some say if this happened during the first 3 days of the sale, the wine is considered to have spoiled while under ownership of the seller, so the sale is invalid. Others say that the spoilage is entirely the fault of whoever owns it at the moment. It said we follow the second opinion. It also qualifies the particular blessings on various other drinks, such as date beer, barley beer, and water steeped with wine lees. All have the blessings of Shehakal stated on them. This is more particularly qualified. Further, regarding water steeped with wine lees, it's debated in regards to their tithing and consecration, and it's a general debate if such a substance is considered to be water or wine by these laws. Related, it said that on Shabbos, by the Kiddush blessing said over a cup of wine before the meal, the wine used should be wine fit to be used as a libation on the altar. It's argued as to what this excludes. It said grape juice is still allowed, mixed wine and water is not excluded, as that actually improves the wine. So rather, what it's excluding is wine that smells poorly or wine that was left uncovered, which cannot be used even if strained, as though there's no longer a health concern as it was strained, is still improper. Also, it said it's proper to use red wine specifically. Anyways, when it ended by saying that purchasing kegs in Sharon, you accept 10 poor quality ones for every 100, this refers to ones that were cracked and resealed with sulfur. If they're not resealed, they don't need to be accepted at all. New Mishnah. If somebody sells wine to another and it sours, he's not responsible for the loss. If, however, it's known that the seller's wine sours, the sale is considered made in error and must be refunded. If the seller says he's selling flavorful wine, meaning wine that will last long, it must last until the holiday of Shavuos. If the seller said he's selling old wine, it must be at least a year old. If he says he's selling aged wine, it must be at least 3 years old. The Gemara says regarding responsibility being held with the seller for wine spoilage, this is explained to be if he transferred the wine to the buyer's cask, and also that the wine was specified as cooking wine. Others disagree, and as was briefly stated a bit earlier, they hold that wine spoilage is just the fault of whoever owns it at the moment. Some related verses are quoted. It's also stated if somebody sold a barrel of wine to a store to be used for a long period and it spoiled while there was still a half or a third remaining, the storekeeper can return this barrel. However, if the storekeeper changed the spigot or if market day had arrived, the seller is no longer responsible. There are similar points quoted. When it was said that the sale of aged wine must be from 3 years prior, it's added that the wine still cannot spoil until the following Sukkot holiday. New Mishnah. If somebody sells a lot to his fellow or accepts a contract on a lot from somebody to construct a wedding house for his son or a widowhood house for his daughter, some say it should be 4 by 6 cubits, others say this is way too small. If somebody wants to build a cattle barn, it should be 4 by 6 cubits. A small house should be 6 by 8 cubits. A large house should be 8 by 10 cubits. A tractate, which is a structure that will be defined, must be 10 by 10 cubits. All of these structures must have their heights be half their length plus half their width. It said this is similar to the construction of the sanctuary of the temple. The Gemara says the specification of a wedding house for a son and a widowhood house for a daughter is to teach us that it's not proper for a man to live in his father-in-law's house. It quotes some sources. It also debates who quoted the measurements of a cattle barn, and as for the tractate structure, it's said to be a pavilion that's adorned with roses. It's also said that a mansion courtyard is 12 by 12 cubits. Anyways, we said that the height of the structures was half the width plus half the length. Others disagree and say the height must be the same length as the roof beams, which is different than the width, as you have to account for perhaps the house widening near the top or for sockets that the beams extend into. Anyways, it also discusses the structure of the temple sanctuary along with how the cherubim, the cherubs on the ark, fit inside the room, accounting for the small dimensions, as they were simply a bit too small to fit according to the precise measurements that are given, so it said that they just stood miraculously. Now, some verses reference the cherubim as facing towards each other, and others reference them as facing away from each other. Some explain this, that when the Jewish people did God's will, they faced towards each other, and when they did not, they faced away from each other. Others just explained that they were positioned at an angle. New Mishnah. If somebody owns a water cistern inside somebody's house, he's allowed to enter and leave to get water only at a time that people typically do so. He cannot bring his animal inside. He would need to fill up a container to bring to his animal. And additionally, both the cistern owner and house owner make themselves a lock. The Gemara clarifies these two locks are both placed on the cistern. The house owner's lock is there so that the cistern owner won't enter without him being there, which could lead to suspicions of adultery with his wife. New Mishnah. If somebody owns a garden behind somebody else's garden, and he has a right of way through the others, he can only enter and leave at times that people typically do so. He cannot bring merchants into his garden to buy produce, nor can he use this just as a shortcut to enter into a different field. The owner of the outer garden can plant things in the path. That's if the garden path goes through the middle of the outer garden. If they agree to have the path off to the side of the garden, he can enter and leave whenever he wants. He can bring merchants into the garden, although he still cannot use it as a shortcut, and neither party can plant anything on the path. The Gemara says if somebody buys a canal through somebody's property for an irrigated field, The canal must be 2 cubits wide, along with an additional cubit on either side for the banks. If the canal was for a pond, it must be a cubit wide, with half a cubit on either side for the banks. Regarding these banks, some say the property owner can sow plants or trees in the banks, others say he can only plant trees, as seed roots would damage the earth and collapse the bank. Additionally, if a canal does collapse, it can be repaired with soil from that field, as that was a condition to have the canal go through that property. New Mishnah. If somebody had a public path passed through his field and he took it for himself and designated a new public path off to the side, then both paths are designated as public paths and he cannot undo this. The standard width of a private path is 4 cubits and the standard width of a public thoroughfare is 16 cubits. A king's thoroughfare and a path to a grave have no limit. The Ma'amad ceremony, which is done in return from a burial from a cemetery, as will be described, is done in an area of 4 kav. The Gemara says, a man cannot designate his path as the public thoroughfare in exchange for the current public path, as it was instituted that this is impermissible in case somebody tries to replace a public path with a crooked one. Alternatively, it's just that this specific case was where the man was actually trying to replace the public path with a crooked one. Alternatively, it's an issue with any type of path, as it could be you're moving it further away for some people. Additionally, it was said that if the man designated his path for the public, he cannot take it back. This is in accordance with the opinion that if the public chooses a path through somebody's field, it cannot be undone. This opinion is additionally qualified and sourced, saying that the public can acquire this path by walking through it. Others disagree, but they would agree that a path can be acquired via walking through a vineyard specifically, as that is intended for walking. The standard width of a path, if there are walls, is enough that a man can carry a load of branches on his shoulders and turn around in all directions without touching the borders. If there are no walls, the minimum width should be enough for a person to put one foot in front of the other. Anyways, we had stated that the standard width of a private path was 4 cubits. Others say it was actually wide enough for a donkey that's carrying things to walk through, which is a bit less than 2.5 cubits. It's also said the standard width of a path between cities is 8 cubits, a public thoroughfare, as mentioned, is 16 cubits, and a path to a city of refuge is 32 cubits, which is based on a verse. A king's path was said to have no limits, as he's allowed to even break through the fences of surrounding property to make a path. The path to a grave has no limit, to honor the dead with the funeral procession. Regarding the Ma'amad ceremony, which was essentially a series of eulogies given over on the path back from somebody's grave, it said no less than 7 of these are done, and some say it's only done in the actual cemetery. New Mishnah. If somebody sells a lot to somebody to make a catacomb, or somebody agrees to build a catacomb on his property, each crypt must be 4 by 6 cubits and must have 8 recesses for the actual bodies, 3 on each side and 2 in front. Each recess must be 4 cubits by 6 handbreadths and 7 handbreadths tall. Others say the crypt must be 6 by 8 cubits with 13 recesses, 4 on the side, 3 in front, and 2 in the front diagonals. There must also be a courtyard built at the entrance to the crypt, 6 by 6 cubits, with enough space for the funeral bier and those carrying it. The courtyard must have 2 crypts opening into it. Others say it must have 4 crypts opening into it on all 4 sides. Others say it just depends on the type of rock the grounds are made of there. The Gemara says, regarding the opinion that a standard crypt should have 13 recesses, it's argued how all of these could even fit. It's essentially explained that the inner corners are at slightly different heights, so that way they don't extend into each other. Alternatively, is that the case is regarding a crypt for stillborn children, so there's no concern of the recesses being large enough to touch each other. There are related points on burial crypt dimensions. Essentially, it's a debate as to what the status is if 3 corpses are unearthed in one spot, as to whether the middle corpse is considered existent in regard to registering the area as a graveyard zone. There's a similar case with the dimensions of a vineyard, with the opinion seemingly reversed as to whether the middle vines are considered to be existent in regards to considering the area as a vineyard. The switch is explained that unlike corpses, the extra vines will eventually be uprooted for firewood and can therefore be disregarded. And that's the end of chapter 6.